In 2021, a team of researchers publishing in the journal Nature did something that sounds almost impossible in archaeology. They identified the exact calendar year Vikings were cutting down trees in North America. Not a century, not a decade, one specific year, 1021 AD, nailed down using a method that had nothing to do with artifacts, sagas, or radiocarbon estimates with wide margins of error. They used a cosmic ray event and the wood itself, and in doing so, they turned one of history's most persistent, maybe it's just a legend stories, into one of the most precisely dated events in all of pre-modern archaeology. Vikings reached North America roughly 500 years before Columbus ever left Spain. This isn't a fringe theory or a contested claim anymore. It's confirmed, excavated, and now dated down to the year through real physical science. And the more interesting question isn't whether it happened, it's why, after actually getting there, they left almost no trace, stayed only briefly, and let the entire achievement fade into saga and rumor for nearly 1,000 years before archaeology finally caught up to what Norse storytellers had been saying the whole time. If real history that's stranger and better documented than the popular version is why you're here, subscribe and turn on notifications. We go looking for the next one every week. The story, as preserved in Old Norse sagas, primarily the Saga of Eric the Red and the Saga of the Greenlanders, both written down in Iceland roughly 2 to 3 centuries after the events they describe, follows a chain of exploration that started with Eric the Red's establishment of Norse settlements in Greenland around 985 AD. His son, Leif Erikson, is credited in the sagas with leading an expedition further west that encountered a new, previously unknown land, which the sagas describe in 3 parts: a barren rocky area called Helge land, a forested coastal region called Markland, and a more fertile area to the south called Vinland, apparently named for wild grapes the Norse claim to have found growing there. For centuries, this remained exactly the kind of story historians treat with careful skepticism, an oral tradition, written down generations later, describing places that couldn't be confidently matched to any real geography, mixed in with enough saga-typical drama and embellishment that separating fact from legend seemed genuinely impossible without physical evidence. That changed in 1960, when Norwegian explorer and writer Helge Ingstad, working with his archaeologist wife Anne Stine, located and began excavating a site at Meadows on the northern tip of Newfoundland, Canada, a discovery that would eventually become the first confirmed, undisputed evidence of pre-Columbian European presence in the Americas. The excavations at Meadows, continuing through the 1960s and beyond, revealed the remains of at least 8 buildings constructed in a style unmistakably Norse, turf-walled longhouses matching construction techniques known from Iceland and Greenland in this period, entirely distinct from anything built by the indigenous peoples of the region. Excavators recovered genuinely diagnostic Norse artifacts, a bronze cloakpin of a style specifically associated with Norse dress, iron boat rib, a stone spindle whirl used in Norse-style textile production, and most tellingly, clear evidence of iron working, including a small smithy, at a site and time period where no indigenous American culture is known to have practiced iron smelting. This wasn't ambiguous, it was, and remains, definitively Norse. Carbon dating throughout the following decades placed the site's occupation somewhere in the general range of the late 10th to early 11th century, broadly consistent with the saga's timeline. But radiocarbon dating, however useful, typically comes with error margins spanning decades or more, leaving the exact date of Norse presence at Meadows frustratingly imprecise for 60 years, even with the site's Norse identity firmly established. This is where the 2021 study changes everything, and the method behind it is genuinely elegant. In 2012, researchers studying tree rings worldwide discovered something remarkable. Cosmic ray events, likely triggered by massive solar storms, occasionally spike the concentration of a specific radioactive carbon isotope, carbon-14, in the atmosphere in a single identifiable year, and trees growing at that exact moment absorb and permanently record that spike in the one precise growth ring. One such spike has been reliably dated through independent astronomical and ice core evidence to the year 993 AD. That means any piece of wood containing a tree ring showing this specific carbon-14 spike gives researchers an absolute, unambiguous anchor point. Count the growth rings outward from that marked year to the bark's outer edge, and you know, with year-level precision, exactly when that tree was cut down. A team led by geoscientist Margot Quaitums, working with colleagues including archaeologist Michael D., examined wood samples recovered from the Meadows excavations. Crucially, pieces that showed clear metal tool cutting marks, meaning Norse settlers, not natural decay or indigenous use. had felled them. They identified the 993 AD carbon spike in the sample's growth rings, counted outward to the bark, and determined that the wood had been cut in the year 1021 AD, not sometime around 1000 AD, not the early 11th century. The year 1021, with a confidence level archaeology almost never achieves for events this old, confirmed across multiple samples from different trees, all pointing to the same precise felling date. This makes Lance Ork's Meadows, and by extension confirmed Norse presence in North America, datable with a precision usually reserved for events with written contemporary documentation, even though no contemporary written record of this specific expedition survives at all. It's worth being precise about what this date does and doesn't prove. It confirms Norse activity at this specific site, in this specific year, cutting timber, almost certainly for boat repair or construction, given the site's apparent function as a waystation rather than a permanent colony. It doesn't prove this was the very first Norse landing in North America. The sagas suggest earlier voyages, and the 1021 date simply happens to be the year archaeology can currently prove with certainty, not necessarily the beginning of Norse activity in the region. So why did it end? Why didn't this become the beginning of sustained European colonization 5 centuries before it actually happened? The archaeological evidence at Lance Ork Meadows itself points towards the answer. The site shows signs of relatively short-term, seasonal, or intermittent use rather than a large permanent settlement, more consistent with a base camp for further exploration and resource gathering, sending wood and other materials back to the genuinely permanent, but still small and resource-strained, Norse Greenland colony. The sagas themselves describe conflict with indigenous peoples the Norse called skraeling, a term covering various indigenous groups the expeditions encountered, and while the saga's specific narrative details are treated cautiously by historians given their much later written composition, the broader pattern of contact and eventual withdrawal is entirely consistent with the archaeological picture of a small, vulnerable outpost operating extremely far from any meaningful reinforcement. The Greenland Norse colony itself, the base this expedition was launched from, was never large or secure to begin with, and it would face its own well-documented, separately researched decline over the following centuries, driven by a combination of a cooling climate during the period researchers call the Little Ice Age, isolation from European trade networks, and resource pressure in an already marginal environment. A distant, small, poorly supplied outpost thousands of miles further west in contested territory with indigenous populations who vastly outnumbered any Norse expedition was never likely to survive as a colony under those conditions, regardless of what resources Vinland itself or what's left, largely, is the archaeology at Lance or Meadows itself, and the sagas that preserved a folk memory of the achievement long after the physical outpost was abandoned, garbled just enough over 3 centuries of oral transmission and saga composition that historians spent most of the 20th century unsure how much of it to believe. Then a Norwegian explorer walked the Newfoundland coastline in 1960, following local rumors of old, unusual house ruins. And 60 years after that, a research team used a solar storm recorded in tree rings to prove that Norse ships, sailing 500 years before Columbus, had reached the shores of North America in the precise year 1021. A piece of European contact with the Americas so far ahead of the version most people learned in school that it took physical evidence, sitting quietly in the growth rings of long-dead trees, to finally convince everyone the sagas had been telling the truth all along.